It will certainly be no surprise if I say to you that most Catholics' experience of the sacrament of reconciliation has changed drastically in the course of the last 30 years. At one time, it was common practice for many Catholics to come to the sacrament of reconciliation, going to confession, we most often called it, twice a month or perhaps once a week. And now those same Catholics or their children find it no surprise to say that they have not been to the sacrament of reconciliation for several months or a year. Why the enormous change? Well, I think there are many reasons. Indeed, one could argue that in the history of the Church, the sacrament of reconciliation has been a kind of barometer. Whenever the Church has passed through a period of rethinking its own mission, one of the places that rethinking shows up most sharply and clearly is in the way the sacrament of reconciliation is celebrated by people. If that's true, and it certainly has been the case that in the last 30 years the Church has rethought its nature and its mission a very great deal, then we should not be surprised to find that the way in which reconciliation is experienced by most Catholics has also changed a very great deal. One way to approach the sacrament of reconciliation today would be to address the question which is the most often asked question about the sacrament among Catholics at the present time, at least in my experience. And that question is, what do we need the priest there for? Why can't we, as Catholics, approach in prayer our ever-loving and merciful Father, admit our sinfulness, ask for forgiveness, and be assured of that forgiveness in our lives? Why do we need a priest to confess to? Why do we need the priest to assure us of God's forgiveness? I mean, it's all well and good to say that's how the Church understands the sacrament has been set up in accord with the mind of Christ. That only moves the question back a stage. The question would then be, well, why is the mind of Christ that the sacrament be arranged this way? It's a very important question, in fact, because I think that it points to a very important misunderstanding about the nature of sin. The assumption seems to be that sin separates us from God, and it is our relationship with God which needs to be healed. If that were completely and simply the case, then it would be quite true, I think, to say that we don't need the presence of this other human being. We can simply confess directly to God and be assured of God's forgiveness. But sin doesn't simply separate us from God. Sin separates us from one another. And that is the important consideration which needs to be addressed. We tend to assume that sin is a private obstacle, that is to say, an obstacle between God and me, when in fact, sin is a radical injustice. It's a wrong that I have done to you, not simply an obstacle that I've placed to my relationship with God. Let me give an example, if I may. It's an example that I first used years ago in talking with fairly young children preparing for the sacrament of reconciliation. And you'll pardon me if it sounds like a somewhat simple example. Think of people working together on an assembly line in a factory. Each one of the people on that assembly line has his or her own unique task to do, which contributes to making the finished product whatever it may be. Each one of the people on that assembly line has to presume that all of the other people on the line are working as fast and efficiently, as hard and as devotedly as they can. Indeed, if 9 out of 10 of the people on that assembly line did exactly what they were supposed to do, but the 10th one neglected to fulfill his or her part of the job, at the end, you wouldn't have a finished product, you'd just have junk. The person who neglects to fulfill his or her part of the job on the assembly line succeeds in destroying the good work of all of the other members of the assembly line, although they may have been working as hard as they could. I think one could say much the same about the effect of sin in the life of the church. After all, each one of us is called to a unique role in fulfilling the life of the church. The church's role in the world is to make Christ fully present at all times and all places. But each one of us makes Christ present in a very unique and special way. After all, each one of us is related to other people in a way that no one else is. I'm related to my parents, my brother, my sister, my niece, my nephew, my students, my colleagues, in a way that you are not. And you're related to your families and friends and colleagues in ways that I'm not. So if my parents are going to see Christ present in their eldest son, if my brother and sister are going to see Christ present in their older brother, if my niece and nephew are going to see Christ present in their uncle, if my friends are going to see Christ present in their friend, I have to make Christ present because no one else fills those particular and peculiar roles. And if you are going to make Christ present to your family and friends and colleagues, only you can perform that work. I can't because I don't stand in those relationships to those people. That means that if I fail to make Christ obviously and truly present in my life, that part of the church's work, the work of making Christ present as fully as possible at all times and in all places to all people, that part of the church's work has not been accomplished. And if I fail to accomplish that part of the work, the whole work of God's people is impaired. My inability to make Christ fully present weakens your work as part of the church. My sinfulness hurts your work. The fact is that each one of us, by our failure to live the Christian life as fully and obviously as possible, is undermining the mission of the church into which all of us have been called by our baptisms. Our sinfulness hurts one another. Therefore, we need to be reconciled with one another. And so when we come to the sacrament of reconciliation, we are not only being reconciled with God, we are being reconciled with the church, with the rest of the community. And that is why the priest must be present in the sacrament of reconciliation. Not first and foremost because the priest is a spokesperson for God, but because the priest is the representative of the community. And in being reconciled through that representative of the community with the whole church, I am also entering into full communion once again with the head of the community, Christ himself. It is by being reconciled with one another that we return to full communion with God. Unless we understand the reality of the social significance of our sin, we cannot begin to understand the social dimension of our reconciliation with one another in the church. Reconciliation never means a wiping away of the past. We never simply obliterate our sinfulness. Instead, we catch that sinfulness up into a new and wider experience of the love of God and of our communion with one another. When St. Augustine wrote his Confessions in the 390s, after he completed the narrative of his early sinful life and his subsequent conversion, he raised a very interesting and very important question. He asked whether it was a good thing that he had written the narrative in the first place. For if his sinfulness was now something that he had come to regret deeply, and for which he believed God had forgiven him, what was the point in remembering that sinfulness? Should it not simply be obliterated? Should he not simply put his past behind him and start afresh? And Augustine's answer was a very profound and a very important one. Augustine responded that his sinfulness led him to recognize the love of God, that it was only when he recognized the depth of sin's presence in his life that he was able to see who God was and how God worked in his life. Indeed, the remembrance of his sinfulness was, he was convinced, a very necessary part of his praise of God throughout the Confessions. How could he praise God as his Savior without remembering what it was that God had saved him from? Therefore, reconciliation, Augustine recognized, was not the wiping clean of a slate so that one could start fresh. It was recapturing the whole of one's past life from a brand new angle. It was re-envisioning who one was and how one had lived in a new context. It was seeing one's own selfishness, one's own blindness, one's own sinfulness as being loved and embraced by God, so that the very meaning of that sinfulness was changed. We still celebrate year after year that insight of Augustine's when, at the Easter Vigil, during the course of the proclamation of the Lord's resurrection, the great Exultet hymn early in the course of the Easter Vigil, the Church proclaims, "O happy fault, O necessary sin of Adam." Those are Augustine's words from one of his Easter sermons. Here we have one of the great fathers of the Church able to call the fall of humanity a happy fault. Why happy? Certainly, Augustine is not in any way downplaying the evil of the fall of humanity. What he is saying, however, is that the very depth of that evil has been transformed in the extraordinary gift of God's love, which is manifested to us in the incarnation and in the redemption. And because of that enormous manifestation of love, even that sinfulness can now be celebrated. We can actually celebrate our sinfulness because the love of God so completely surpasses our capacity for evil. As St. Paul says, where there has been great sin, there is even more grace. It is that conviction, It is that great Augustinian insight which allows us to celebrate reconciliation, to genuinely make it into an occasion of joy within the life of the church and within our own personal lives. The sacrament of reconciliation is not a time for mourning, because it is not about how wicked I've been. It's a celebration because it's about how good God is. Like all sacraments, it is not first and foremost about my action, it's about God's action. And if we recognize that, then the sacrament of reconciliation might no longer be perceived as a burden which periodically we have to be willing to shoulder. Instead, it becomes a source of joy as the community recognizes that though all have sinned, all may be forgiven, because all are embraced by the love of God. The fact is, my sinful brothers and sisters, we have all been condemned. But what is even more important, my redeemed brothers and sisters, is that all of us can be reconciled. It is that needs to be celebrated. If we recognize the communal dimension of our sinfulness and our reconciliation, and acknowledge that what is being celebrated is not the depth of our sin, but the height of God's love, then the sacrament of reconciliation might yet have a new birth in our community.